Okay, we're in our final section here of chapter 23 on animal tissues and organization, and we are talking about homeostasis, which means that as conditions in the body and out of the body change, the body is required or is necessary for it to be able to bring conditions back to some sort of norm. The overall trend and pattern that we see with animal evolution is that animals become more and more and more specific over time, and so it's a bit of a double-edged sword. Becoming more specific lets you do more stuff, lets you be bigger, lets you become more complex, lets you be more active and colonize new kinds of habitats and things like that. But being more specialized also means that you're more picky. And the conditions inside your body need to be more and more specific because otherwise that very complex, very picky body is going to fail to function. So we have to maintain relatively consistent conditions inside the body as much as we can outside the body. So this is a bit like a thermostat in a house where if a house has both heating as well as central air, there are continuously going to be adjustments made to maintain some sort of consistent temperature, which might be comfortable for the people living in that house. So if we look at the organism itself, inside the body, the conditions tend to be relatively stable, and the fluctuations that do occur tend to be relatively small. On the other hand, outside the body, conditions can fluctuate a lot. You think about what happens throughout the course of a day or two, right? The temperature can change by 30 or 40 degrees. Temperature in your body doesn't change that much. Right? It's going to change by a fraction of a degree, if that, before the body brings it back toward what your more or less normal body temperature might be. So inside the body, relatively stable. Outside the body, relatively variable. Our bodies have to work pretty hard in a lot of ways to maintain stability and consistency in the conditions that we're talking about. So we look at different kinds of conditions, right? So here's a bunch of different conditions. We've got body temperature. We have ways to keep body temperature within the realm. If the body temperature gets too warm, body can cool itself off. Body gets too cold, body can warm itself back up again. We look at blood glucose concentration. Later on, we're going to talk about insulin and glucagon and hormones like that released from the pancreas to help maintain consistent levels of blood glucose. Blood volume, right? So that's where a big part of the urinary system comes in, is making sure blood volume is within the normal range of where it should be. That also goes with electrolyte concentration as well, and pH. Tension in the tendons, right? So we want to make sure we have enough tension on them without too much tension, so they might tear. pH we talked about. We don't want to be too acidic or too basic in the blood or anywhere else for that matter. And then finally, oxygen and CO2 concentrations. The body is actually set up to maintain a relatively consistent level of CO2 in the blood. A lot of people kind of intuitively think it's oxygen, but in fact it's CO2 that the body tries to maintain a relatively set concentration of. So the kinds of things we need to have these conditions for would be things like functioning of neurons, muscle contractions. Enzymes are a really big one because enzymes are really, really sensitive to fluctuations in things like temperature and pH and osmolarity. And so if enzymes don't find their environment suitable, they're going to start to fall apart. They're going to start to denature. And as we have kind of talked about before, enzymes are absolutely critical for just about all functioning inside the body. All the chemical reactions in the body need to have enzymes to happen because otherwise they would happen way too slowly to support the life of a multicellular organism. We have typically in the central nervous system, as we talked about in the last section, what we call an integrating center. And the integrating center is kind of like a link. So for part of the body, we have sensory receptors, right? So we have heat receptors and cold receptors and pain and pH and stretch receptors and all those kinds of things, sending information to the brain and spinal cord all the time. But the brain and spinal cord has to decide whether or not it needs to do something about those conditions. So in other words, if the conditions are relatively okay, then the brain and spinal cord say, hey, no change needed whatsoever. But if pH starts to drop, or if temperature starts to rise, or if blood volume is too low, or if ion concentration is off, then the integrating center kicks in and tells the final step, which would be the effectors, the motor neurons, to go ahead and tell muscle cells to contract or glands to release hormones or those kinds of things. So those would be the effectors, right? So we've got kind of three steps in this whole system of maintaining homeostasis. We have a sensory step, we have an integration step, and we have an effector step. So we can detect changes, we can decide whether something needs to happen about them in response to them, and we can also cause a response to happen as a result as well. So, for example, temperature, right? In mammals and birds, which are endothermic, what you kind of historically would have known as being warm-blooded, we maintain our temperature independent of what the environment is. So if the environment is 30 degrees Fahrenheit, the body is 98.6. If the environment is 105 degrees, body temperature is 98.6. If the temperature of the environment is 70 degrees, body temperature is 98.6. So it doesn't change a whole lot most of the time. So in our case, we maintain kind of this monitoring and integrating of information coming in the hypothalamus, which is a really important part of the brain that we're going to see later on, especially in the chapter on the endocrine system. The hypothalamus is continuously receiving sensory input from heat receptors throughout the body and monitoring how warm the body actually is. If the body becomes too warm or if the body cools off too much, the hypothalamus can kick in, and this will result in a variety of homeostatic mechanisms causing the body temperature to go back toward where it's supposed to be. In other animals, most other animals tend to be ectothermic, with the exception of some really, really big fish and some really, really big reptiles. Most other animals are ectothermic, and they are more subject to being at the mercy of the environment and having their temperature more or less similar to what it is in the environment, within a fairly narrow range. So for these kinds of organisms, they actually get their body heat from the environment. So instead of having a metabolic way of producing body heat, they have a behavioral way of producing body heat. So if a lizard needs to warm up, if it's too cold for what its body needs to do, that lizard can go and lay in the sun for a little bit longer. Or if the animal gets too warm, it can climb out of the sun and go crawl into the shade for a little while and maintain homeostasis that way. So all of these organisms, most reptiles, amphibians, most fishes, and invertebrates are all ectothermic. So homeostasis is maintained through what we call a negative feedback mechanism. And negative in this case does not mean bad. That's the number one thing I see people get confused on with this lecture, is that people think negative is equivalent to being bad. Like negative feedback is when you get a bad grade on a test. That's not what it is, right? Negative feedback maintains consistency, right? So we talked about these systems before. We have sensors that are picking up conditions and monitoring conditions all the time. Cells, membrane receptors, monitoring temperature, pressure, osmolarity, pH, stretch, those kinds of things all the time. We also have the comparator or integrating center, as we described it before, which is taking the information from the sensory cells and determining whether conditions are within the range of acceptability or if they need to change in response to a change in the environment, for example. And then if a change is needed, there's going to be the effectors that kick in. If the conditions are too far from what we call a set point, then the body needs to kind of activate certain effectors to warm itself up, cool itself down, conserve water, release water, those kinds of things in response to conditions changing in the environment. So the set point, kind of think about it as being like the thermostat on the wall. I want my house to be 68 degrees, whatever. You set the thermostat for 68 degrees. If it gets too warm, the AC kicks on, cools it down. If it gets too cool, the furnace kicks on, brings it back up again. The set point is where you want to be. And the set point for the average human, for temperature, for example, is 98.6. The average set point for pH in the blood, for example, is around 7.35. It varies a little bit person to person, but those are kind of the points we have set on our thermostats for just a couple of conditions that I mentioned a second ago. So those are the effectors, right? Effectors typically are muscles and glands. These are the things that actually have the power to change conditions in the body as needed. This is an example of an ecological feedback mechanism where we have negative feedback here. So we have sunlight promoting photosynthesis and plant growth in the water. So sunlight has a positive effect on plant biomass. But as plant biomass gets more and more and more, there's going to be more and more shading, more and more blocked sunlight. And so this has a negative effect on sunlight penetration in the water. Well, if there's less sunlight reaching the water, now all of a sudden there's going to be less plant biomass. If plant biomass goes down too far, then all of a sudden sunlight penetration is more, and you get more plant biomass. So this first cycle over here is promoting stability. It's promoting roughly the same amount of plant growth all the time because of negative feedback. Just like the thermostat in your house. If it gets too warm, cool it down. If it gets too cool, warm it up, right? Same idea. Same thing over here. Plant biomass fed on by fish. If fishes overconsume the plants, if they consume too much, plant biomass goes down. If there's not enough plant biomass to go around anymore, then all of a sudden fish biomass goes down as well. And if fish biomass goes down too far, then all of a sudden you're going to have more plants again. So all of this, again, is helping to maintain consistency in the environment for both plant biomass and fish biomass. Now this one up top here is a positive feedback situation that we're going to talk about here in a few minutes. We'll come back to that one here in a few minutes. All right, so this is a really generic but a really good picture, flowchart of what homeostasis looks like. You got some type of stimulus in the environment, something that causes your body to deviate from whatever the set point is. Wherever you are supposed to be, the stimulus is causing you to not be there anymore. Sensors are going to pick that up. Sensors are going to say, hey, something's not right here. Temperature's too high, temperature's too low, osmolarity is off, pH is off, stretch is off, whatever. Sensors are picking up that information all the time and sending it toward the integrating center, like the hypothalamus, like we talked about a few minutes ago for temperature. Integrating center is consistently always receiving this information from all the various sensors in the body. And then after a period of time, the integrating center says, okay, wait a minute, the conditions have changed too much. Temperature is way too high. Temperature is way too low. Okay, effectors, time to turn on, time to do your thing, time to bring temperature back down again. And so the muscles and glands and those kinds of things are going to have some sort of response that's going to cause the system to move back toward the set point. So the analogy would be like the effectors being the AC unit in the furnace in the house, causing the temperature to go back toward the set point. It's a balancing act, so to speak. Homeostasis is balance. All right, so a really good example of homeostasis relates to blood glucose. We have what we call here antagonistic hormones that are involved in maintaining blood glucose. So if you consume a really glucose-rich meal, lots of excess simple sugars in that meal, there are glucose receptors throughout the body that can tell how much glucose you have in your blood at any given point in time. If glucose levels get above some threshold, if things are working properly, assuming you're not diabetic, your pancreas is going to release insulin, which is going to help bring glucose levels back down again. So as insulin is secreted, the pancreas is secreting insulin, body cells, skeletal muscle cells, liver cells, and so on are going to help take glucose out of the blood and store it up for later. And as glucose is taken out of the blood, then all of a sudden the blood glucose begins to fall back down again to where it's supposed to be. On the other hand, if blood glucose levels fall too far, if you're now 5 hours from the last bite of food that you had, your blood glucose is now lower. Now your pancreas, different cells in the pancreas, mind you, are going to release a different hormone called glucagon. And glucagon is the antagonist to insulin. If insulin decreases blood glucose, glucagon is going to increase blood glucose. So they have sort of a push-pull effect. If one of them is activated, the other one is inhibited. If the other one is activated, the first one is inhibited. So they're always kind of working against each other based on what conditions are going on in the body at that point in time. If we look at a high temperature, if receptors in the body are telling the hypothalamus that body temperature is now too high, the hypothalamus detects that, and you're going to have excess, or not excess, but more blood flowing closer to the surface of the skin where it can get rid of heat more easily, just like a radiator does. We can have sweating. We can have a decrease in metabolic rate because elevated metabolism produces body heat, which is going to only exacerbate things if body temperature is already too high. You might want to bring temperature back down a little bit to produce less heat is a possibility. On the other hand, if temperature is too low, then we have to conserve heat. So maybe we want to keep blood closer to the core and keep it further away from the skin to help conserve the heat we do have and protect those vital internal organs. Maybe we want to start having contractions of skeletal muscles that we call shivering. Shivering is where skeletal muscles contract really fast and in the process generate a lot of heat to help warm you up. Maybe you want to elevate your basal metabolic rate, burn more calories, crank up the furnace, produce excess heat to help warm up your body if it's too cold. So again, it's a push-pull kind of a thing. It's antagonistic effects. Some things bring temperature up, other things bring temperature down. Right? So this is the analogy we had for a thermostat, right? We have a set point in the house, maybe at 68 degrees Fahrenheit. If the temperature changes too much, the thermometer or thermostat detects that change. And if the temperature is too high, the AC turns on, the furnace turns off, room cools down, goes closer to the set point, and sensors continuously monitor this to make sure it's within the realm where it needs to be. On the other hand, if the temperature drops too far, the AC shuts off, the furnace turns on, and now the room's going to warm up closer to where it needs to be. So the key to this is right here in the middle. There's always monitoring going on inside the body. You can't just have a change and then shut everything down and assume everything's going to stay the same forever. You've got to continuously monitor the situation to make sure the conditions are continuously within the range of where they need to be. This is what we talked about before with body temperature. If body temperature deviates too far from the set point here, hypothalamus gets information from sensory cells. Now we have dilation of blood vessels to promote heat loss, sweating to promote heat loss, and both of those two things together are going to help you drop your body temperature down. If temperature is too cool, now the blood vessels in the skin contract, so they're going to vasoconstrict. You're going to keep blood out away from the skin, closer to the core, and you're going to shiver, and both of those effects are going to help you bring body temperature back up toward the set point. right? So it's kind of this antagonistic sort of a thing. Now, positive feedback is a much less common sort of a thing because positive feedback promotes instability. Negative feedback is stability. Positive feedback is instability. So in this case, we have, let's see, blood clotting. This one's a better example, probably easier to imagine. Contraction during childbirth. Right, so at some point in time, after 38 weeks or so, give or take, of gestation, the fetus that's been developing for the past 38 weeks is now relatively enormous, and it's going to exert a fair amount of pressure on the walls of the uterus. As that occurs, stretch receptors in the walls of the uterus are going to start to send information to the brain saying, hey, this thing's getting big. It's stretching us out a lot, so we probably should do something about this. So what happens in the brain then is that the posterior pituitary is going to release a hormone called oxytocin. Oxytocin, among other things, is a very, very good promoter of smooth muscle contraction. So as oxytocin is released into the blood, it's going to cause contraction of smooth muscles in the myometrial lining of the uterus. And as that muscle contracts, it's also going to stretch. Well, before, didn't we say that stretch receptors are kind of what kicked off this whole thing? So if those muscle contractions are causing more stretching, now those stretch receptors are going to kind of ramp up the volume a little bit and yell at the brain even louder that, hey, now we're really stretching. You really should do something about this. So what does the brain do? It releases even more oxytocin, which causes even more smooth muscle contraction, which causes even more contractions, which eventually results in childbirth. There's an endpoint to positive feedback. Positive feedback is like a snowball effect. A little change eventually leads to some big result. And at that point, it's done. Right, so that's kind of the end of the road for positive feedback. So we don't see quite as many of those sorts of situations in animal bodies because they tend to be very much of a destabilizing sort of effect. So this is what we just talked about. We have the fetus pushing against the uterine opening, the cervix more or less. Stretch receptors are going to pick up that stretching, send the information to the integrating center in the brain. We're going to have oxytocin released from the posterior pituitary, which causes contractions in smooth muscle, which then results in more stretching, which results in more information coming into integrating center, which results in more oxytocin, which leads to more stretching, until eventually the contractions are hard enough that labor and delivery are complete. All right, so that's the end of our chapter 23. We're going to go ahead and cut this off here, and we will start up with the next chapter.